Mr. Assistant Secretary General, we are pleased to meet you here in Baku. Welcome to Azerbaijan. And we know you have a very challenging agenda within your visit, especially in light of recent developments and considering dozens of official meetings and speeches on a regular basis. So, taking this opportunity, I'll try to pose specific questions regarding the sustainable finance in the context of the COP29 preparations. We know that this year Azerbaijan will host the COP29, and this is a big opportunity and responsibility at the same time. And in this regard, the sustainable finance for development, for climate action and NDCs are of great importance. And my first question is about the sustainable finance as it is. What does it stand for? People may wonder, what is the sustainable finance?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be in Baku. I think it is incredibly an important year. And I think the Azerbaijani government is going to do a great job hosting the COP. And we as UNDP are ready to support in whatever we can. Now, there is no official global agreed definition for sustainable finance, right? And that's fine, because in the end of the day, the end game here is that all finance is sustainable. We're not there, right? We clearly have a financial system that prioritizes almost exclusively profit over any other type of results that it can get it. So the expression of sustainable finance comes to kind of complement the reality of finance today with a notion that finance is a means, not an end. If it is a means and not the end, what is the end? Well, the end is an environment that is well established. It is money flowing to issues that address the climate crisis, money flowing from both public and private, to gender empowerment, or moving from international crossing borders towards countries that don't necessarily receive the attention the international financial highways, right? So continent of Africa, and other countries in the world. So sustainable finance in that sense is a catch-all expression, right, to the part of the finance system today that is trying to achieve profitability, because there's nothing wrong with that, but also generate a social and an environmental return at the same time. Different instruments of traditional finance have been used, right, and have been adapted in innovative ways to generate resources for those, if you want, objectives. An example is the growth of green bonds, right? Green bonds, this is one of the fast type of thematic debt instrument. It's relatively recent, has grown into the trillions of dollars. However, it's only 2% of the global bond market. So as fast as it's growing, it's really small comparing to the size of the bond market. So again, as I said, the objective in the end is that entire bond market is delivering a green, a social, and a profitability return. Therefore, you don't need to have an expression, sustainable finance, because all finance is sustainable.
Thank you, sir. That's getting very clear. We listened to your lecture at the other university, and you brought up very interesting topic of finance and the Paris Agreement's national determined contributions, so to say NDCs. And what's the main linkage? Could you please express your vision on this issue?
The NDCs are the sovereign, every country in the world has every 5 years to present to the Paris Agreement, to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? A policy statement on how they are, increasing the policies, the domestic work towards mitigation and adaptation. So that's what an NDC is. Now, an NDC needs to be actionable because it doesn't really matter what is in the document unless it becomes reality. A part of the problem that we've seen throughout any policy process is there is a disconnection between the policy statement, in this case the NDC, and the finance necessary to implement it, the NDCs or any other policy statement, right? So this is a problem that has persisted in governments throughout the world for decades, which is this notion that you have two moments on policy making that are not connected. The substantive policy and the financial policy. So what I said at the other university, what we're trying to do as UNDP is to bring those two pieces closer together. So an NDC that not only represents and clearly states the ambitions of a country towards 1.5 degrees, that has clear sectoral objectives for mitigation and identify for adaptation, but also that we are able to cost it. So how much is going to cost to implement this NDC in the next 5 years? How much money is available in the countries today? Domestic, public, private, international. What is the gap between the existing availability of resources and the cost, right? How can this gap be closed domestically and international? Through taxation, through green bonds, through ODA, right? So that is where the connections between finance planning, right, and the NDCs are becoming so important. Because in the end of the day, right, nothing that does not have a financial plan will get done, will get implemented. So, right, so the connection of finance and the NDC is actually under the assumption that makes them easier to be implemented. They are more actionable when they have financial plan behind.
That was a very interesting point, sir. And let's talk about the sustainable finance ecosystem. And considering the COP29 preparations, the sustainable finance ecosystem is getting extremely important because many other things depend on it. And countries try to make finance work for people and the planet. And from this angle, it's worthwhile to better understand the integrated national financing frameworks, so to say INFFs. How it works, sir?
So the INFFs are the approach, are the instruments that we've created at UNDP together with partners like UNDESA, the European Union, and others, that does exactly what I described earlier. So the INFF is nothing more than a systematic way to create a financial plan behind a policy document. Now, it's a whole of government and ideally whole of society exercise. We believe it needs to be, in the case of the NDCs, needs to be led by ministers of environment and ministers of finance. Usually the existing INFFs tends to be mostly led by ministers of finance, right? Because ministers of finance, in that disconnection between planning and finance, are really the ones that haven't connected. A minister of planning does the plan, the minister of finance is not in the room. So but they're the ones that hold the money, right? So you need to bring ministers of finance in this conversation. You need to make them feel powerful and empowered that they are designing a financial plan that is, one, capable to deliver the policy statement on an NDC or an SDG plan, but two, that are not going to put at jeopardy the macroeconomic stability of a country, right? So we were talking about debt instruments, green bonds, SDG bonds, and all those instruments that are part of this ecosystem that you've described. The important point here is to make sure that those instruments are done in a way that is fiscal and macroeconomic responsible, right? Because you don't necessarily want to create an inflation, or you don't want to create it, unnecessarily debt sustainability issues in that sense. So Ministers of Finance are really, really the key element on this. So the INFF, I'll give a few examples, right? Now, for example, in Mongolia, we know that to deliver the SDG into 2030, Mongolia is going to cost $15.7 billion, right? That's what the INFF process has told us. Now, we also know that the government of Mongolia has made decisions about, using taxation as a big chunk of that money. Now, when that decision was made, there was realization the tax system needs to be changed. So policy reform on the tax systems has happened. The government also wants the private sector to be part of it. And one of the things that he done, there is a stock exchange in Mongolia with a market capitalization, of a certain level. And what the government has done is that it has changed a regulation in the stock exchange that all companies that are listed there have to disclose how their business is dealing with the climate changing, right? So that creates an incentive and an alignment of the business operating model of those companies that are in the stock exchange to actually internalize climate into their business models and their business process. Therefore, more money then after this process is done, they change their behavior towards being more resilient and less contributing to the climate. So the INFFs have examples like that throughout the world, right? In which they are not only a financial plan, but we're starting to see serious implementation of policy reform and the alignment of resources. Another example that I can give you is a lot of the INFFs are doing, and we're looking at budget expenditures, national budget expenditures, right? So in Colombia, 3 years ago, we actually tagged the entire national budget of Colombia against all the 169 targets of the SDGs, right? And the first time we did this exercise, right, the national budget of Colombia was 42% aligned to the SDGs. Now, you do this once, then you work with the government to change the Minister of Finance or the Budget Office budget note that goes to the line ministries every year. They did that. So next year, we saw an increase from 42 to 48% of the national budget, right, aligned to the SDG. The last year, so 3 years, it went from 48 to 52%. In real terms, in the last 3 years, right, $6 billion, an extra $6 billion, right, of national budget were aligned to the SDGs. And that's what an INFF can do. And we are putting those INFFs behind the NDCs now to kind of provide that financial plan behind.
Thanks so much for the detailed explanation. You provided a couple of examples, including Mongolia. And taking into consideration the things you mentioned, how countries are building their sustainable finance ecosystem through the integrated national financing frameworks?
That's a lot to do with this policy reform, right? To give an idea, in the 86 countries that we've done the INFFs, we've identified 234 areas of policy reforms, from taxation to budget to stock exchanges to public-private partnerships, you name it, right? Now, those 234 areas of policy reforms, they are the ecosystem. Now, there is a realization on the governments that the current ecosystem, it's not going to mobilize, it's not going to align the numbers in Mongolia and other. Hence the need for policy reform. So what the INFFs are doing is pointing the direction of travel, determining with the government, that if you want this level of resources, public and private, domestic, international, the ecosystem has to change. And the ecosystem is composed of those series of policies that needs to be reformed, sometimes new legislation, sometimes new regulations, sometimes banking systems regulations, and so on and so forth. So that's the building of the ecosystem that is coming out of the INFF through those policy reforms, which then, if they are properly done and all done, will generate, first of all, a de-risking for the whole government, right, or for a sector. And that de-risking, policy de-risk is important because it will allow private capital who's looking for a risk-adjusted return to come in, right? Sometimes private capital sits on the side, either within a country or from outside into a country, because of the perception of risk, right? You know, you can de-risk through policy, which is what we're doing with the INFFs.
The risking is one of the conditions.
Yeah, you know, and the risking can happen in many ways, but in general terms, you can have a policy de-risking, which is we at UNDP very versed in, and you know, we do it for renewable energy for many sectors. But eventually, in certain countries, you're still going to need a financial de-risking. And that's when instruments, first loss, guarantees, you know, credit enhancement, you know, in other types different than guarantees, as what is needed to combine with policy, therefore creating an ecosystem, or creating a moment in which the private sector says, okay, I can take that risk now. I can come in, right? And this is very important because you have to remember one thing. The problem that we have in the world today, to deliver the NDCs, to deliver the SDGs, to deliver the Paris Agreement, it's not a problem of money, okay? There is no shortage of money in the world, right? Global wealth is $465 trillion, right? Assets under management at capital markets international is at $163 trillion, right? The gap to finance the SDGs is $3.2 trillion, right? It's less than 1% of global wealth. So the problem is not a problem of quantum of money. The problem is a problem of the money doesn't flow to the geographies that it needs to flow the most. You know, give you an example. In 2023 alone, $1.8 trillion were invested in renewable energy. It was more invested in renewable energy in 2023 than on gas, oil, and coal combined. But only 2% of that money went to the continent of Africa, where you have 600 million people with no access to electricity. So the money is there. What do we need to do for the money to flow to what is needed the most? And that's where this conversation of risk and risk management becomes so important.
Many thanks for the details provided. Well, you know, we like a lot of acronyms, abbreviations, and definitions in the UN system, and sometimes it may lead to certain misconceptions. I think people need to have precise and accurate insights regarding what the things mean. So today we are talking about the financial development and the integrated national financing frameworks. Using this tool, how countries can align their sustainable finance system with the SDGs, climate and environment goals?
Well, I think it starts from the policy. As I said, finance is a means, not an end. And that's one of the problems in the world. You know, I think we have given too much credence to finance or the finance industry as an end in itself, right? So I started from creating policy statements, being an SDGs, being, you know, the Azerbaijani government is preparing its 4th voluntary national review. It's one of the only 5 countries in the world that has done 4 voluntary national reviews to the high-level political forum in New York, and needs to be commended for that. But good, policy design, which then has a financial planning behind, right, can then lead, you know, can set that ecosystem that you've talked about it to address with another real problem, right, which I think governments and private sector and organizations like UN and UNDP need to work on. Even if we were today in the world to kind of magically put all the money together and deal with the risks and all the things, there's a second biggest problem, is the absorption capacity in many governments and the bankable projects. Because in the end, this money has to land somewhere, concretely, being an infrastructure project to create, you know, resilience to climate change, or green infrastructure, you know, create jobs, you know. So there has, you know, we've discussed so far the money side. But there is a genuinely problem with the availability of SDG-aligned, climate-aligned, bankable projects. So one of the things that we at UNDP are doing we've created a methodology called the SDG Impact Investments, in which we actually take the SDGs, right, as the starting point, and then we work through a methodology that we end with what we call investment opportunity areas. Per country, there are more than 650 of investment opportunity areas identified in a platform over 35 countries, right? For billions and billions of potential in that. Now, the good news is we know what the investments are, we know what the policy environment for those sectors and subsectors are. We also know that if those sectors and subsectors are invested, which SDGs they would help deliver. Because we've matched the SDGs to the investment opportunity. Now, we are not designing the specifically bankable projects, but we're giving, if you want, the origination phase of the investment value chain. And then we are working with third parties, we are working with financiers to then start it from those investment maps and investment opportunity areas to actually putting in place the right bankable project, being energy, being in health, being in agriculture. Because in the end, it's an equation, right? You need the money to flow, and you need the project to receive the flow of money. And the result of that value chain, if you want, is more jobs, it's more resilience, it's more economic growth. That's really what needs to happen.
Thank you so much, sir. It's getting quite clear, I think. And talking about the definitions again, as for today's topic, we are talking about the sustainable finance. And thank you for making this clear. And could you please also talk about the recent G7 decisions? What are the results of the climate, environment, and transition energy discussions ahead of the COP29 to find concrete ways to advance the biodiversity and development?
I think this meeting of the G7 in Turin, in Italy, a couple of weeks ago, was perhaps historical. Because this is the first time that the G7, which is basically the rich part of the world, the richest part of the world, have actually committed themselves to completely phased out unabated coal by the early 2030s, which means the latest is 2035, right? It is the strongest signals we can get out of the richest economies in the world, led by Italy, which now hosts the G7 presidency, that they will stop in their own domestic economies, and this includes the European Union as well, right? So all the 27 countries of the EU, they will stop burning the most polluted of all the greenhouse gases, which is coal, right? So that's a very, very powerful signal and something to be commended, right, towards the richest economy. I think the other thing that came out of this G7 is genuinely attempted by the Italian presidency to actually put development into the center of a conversation about climate, energy, and biodiversity, right? Because you can't really, in today's world, separate those issues from poverty, from inequality. They're all in the same pot, right? And you have to deal with them in a multidisciplinary way. And I think that's another thing that the Italian president of the G7 needs to be congratulated for.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And we know that UNDP was asked to support these key initiatives. So what would be a main contribution in the context of the COP29 preparations?
So there's a few different natures in the decisions of the G7. One, for example, we are already running out of a center in Rome, the largest youth for climate outreach in the world, which we are using for the next NDCs, right? So the communique recognizes youth for climate, commits it to keep on supporting and the importance of having the youth voice in the processes of COP29 and beyond.
Yeah, especially in the context of the COP29.
Exactly. So that's the thing, it's an important thing, and UNDP runs this Youth for Climate process. Now, another couple of things that we've been asking UNDP to advance, for the G7. One is the development of its conceptualization of a sustainable land management hub, which has been asked to do together with the Secretariat of the UN Convention on Desertification, right? Which also has a COP in Saudi Arabia after the COP29 in Baku, right? And I think it's very important because land and land management and land restoration is becoming an important element on all three COPs, the biodiversity, the climate, and the desertification COP. I'll give an example. Recently, I was in Brazil looking and working with the government on the NDC, that they're preparing the NDC, and part of the NDC is to restore 30 million hectares of land, so that is a sector priority on the Brazilian NDC to be 1.5 aligned. In theory, land management is in another convention that was also born in Rio in '92. So things are converging in that aspect. So we look forward to working on setting up the sustainable land management. And there were other things like an adaptation platform and coffee initiative to kind of green the coffee industry and make sure that we actually take deforestation and you take other aspects out of the coffee value chain as well. It's important. We all like our morning coffee, and millions of people drink it. So it's an industry that can contribute rather than be a problem, right?
Sir, thank you so much. Huge thanks for the detailed information you provided, and I'm really grateful. And at the end of our conversation, I would like to ask you to share your valuable insights and the major expectations from the COP29 to be held later this year in Baku.
Look, I think the COP29 is the finance COP, right? Is the COP that has to agree on a new quantifiable climate finance goal, right? We've been living in the world of $100 billion. Unfortunately, that $100 billion didn't really materialize from north to south, if you want. And now we have to find out another way to quantify a target for climate finance, right? It is not going to be easy, right? $100 billion was never enough,
Sure.
right? The transition, the green transition is going to cost trillions of dollars. So the truth is, we need a system to be agreed in November in Baku that determines the finance ambitions necessary to match the 1.5 aligned NDC ambitions, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I think we as UNDP would love to help the Azerbaijani government, and the entire international community needs to help the COP presidents to deliver that result. It's a very, very important COP, but I'm assure and reassure the Azerbaijan presidents can do a good job.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned the COP as the finance COP, and that was a very interesting point. I think it's very useful for us as a host country. And Mr. Assistant Secretary General, I'm really grateful to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll look forward to seeing you again later this year.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.